Is the US government about to become one of the biggest XRP holders in the world? You have to listen to this Brad Garlinghouse interview. I'm going to give you my context as we go. This is insane. Let's play it.
Ripple CEO Brad Garlinghouse. Ripple's XRP is the native token of the decentralized blockchain XRP ledger. Litigious. As recently as our conversation with Hester Peirce of the SEC, one of the commissioners, she said that the lawsuit against Ripple was still hovering. Where is it now? Because last night we started to hear that it may be disappearing.
So we have reached agreement with staff. And usually what happens is you reach agreement with staff makes recommendation to the commission, and then the commission votes. So anytime we make announcements about that, we are clear that we've reached agreement with staff. The commission hasn't yet voted. But what we've agreed is to dismiss and move on. We're actually getting, the SEC we had put in escrow a potential fine of $125 million. We're actually taking most of that back, including the interest that had been earned along the way. And I think it's just evidence that the Gensler SEC was on the wrong side of the law. And thanks to the new leadership at the SEC and in the White House, I think we're seeing a much more constructive, much more pro-innovation. We want these industries to grow at home.
When you say most of the $125 million you had parked in that little fund in case of the worst case scenario, what's left? Can you give us some?
The SEC is going to end up with a $50 million. The U.S. government's going to get $50 million. We even talked about making that available in XRP. But look,
imagine the U.S. government becoming one of the biggest XRP holders. You know, obviously they don't have, wouldn't have billions, but $50 million would give them 25 million XRP. 25 million XRP could do a whole lot of damage to paying off national debt if XRP should be or will be, adopted by the US as, the currency that they want to use to move values. Stablecoins, custody, right? The US is going to need a crypto custody provider if they're going to have all of this crypto. Ripple custody? I mean, there's so many ways we could go here, right? Let's keep it going.
At the end of the day, this is a major step forward. I think if you kind of zoom out and look at this, the Trump administration is absolutely living up to their promises. David Sachs leading the effort at the White House, Scott Bessent, and certainly now Paul Atkins getting confirmed, I think, yesterday.
Yes. These
are people who are focused on how do we make sure this is an industry that can thrive at home with sensible regulation.
Really quickly, David Sachs is the crypto czar, Scott Bessent is the treasurer, and then you have the other person that he mentions. Oh, geez. It's been a long day.
And certainly now Paul Atkins,
SEC. Okay, so Paul Atkins understands how important the Ripple case is, and getting him in there, I mean, this is everything that we've always wanted. We wanted to have somebody that was pro-innovation, pro-Ripple, and he definitely is. Sorry for rewinding. I just streamed for like 2 hours and 10 minutes. My mind is a little...
And confirmed, I think, yesterday.
Yes.
These are people who are focused on how do we make sure this is an industry that can thrive at home with sensible regulation, common sense. And that's not what we had for the last 4 years.
True.
What would you hope to see as common sense regulation? Have you talked to David Sachs?
Great question.
And what have you said? Hey, David, this at least needs to be front and center.
The two things that have the most momentum in Capitol Hill are around a stablecoin legislation and then something we generally call a market structure bill. Stablecoin legislation, because we haven't yet had clarity about at what point are banks involved, not involved, what kind of licensing is appropriate. Ripple recently launched our stablecoin under a New York trust license through the New York Department of Financial Services, which we think is kind of the gold standard for how to be regulated in this market.
It is.
But having federal legislation that is providing clarity for the big players like USDC, Circle, as well as Tether is super important. I think we're going to see that sooner rather than later.
President Trump has made big strides that are very pro-crypto. It's got to be great for somebody like you. However, the price of, let's just say Bitcoin, which reached a high after the election of something like $107,000, is nowhere near that now. I think we're around 86,000 and change, but it's been a market drop.
This is brave. Is she really going there? Is she going there?
When do you foresee this moving back up? Because we've seen all kinds of wild projections of something like $250,000 per Bitcoin by the end of this year to people who say this thing's going down.
Yeah. When I think about that, your last guest, Larry Fink, talked about just taking the long-term view.
Right.
And I almost don't think about it in that kind of short-term time frame. I think about what are the macro trends playing out for the crypto industry, for the XRP ecosystem. XRP has been the best performing major crypto in the last 90 days. We think about it as what does that look like over the next 3 years? I'm very optimistic. I mean, Ripple just announced our largest acquisition, actually one of the largest acquisitions in the entire crypto industry to date. We announced it earlier this week on Tuesday in the middle of tariff palooza. I don't know exactly what's going to happen with the tariffs, but we're betting on where the world's going to be in 3 years, not what's going to happen in the next 6 months.
Would you have made that acquisition a year ago?
No. Hard no. Look, the SEC in the United States and even other parts of the Biden administration, it was a coordinated attack across many different agencies.
It was.
We're finding that more and more out now. You already highlighted in your introduction, the IRS had hostile rules about crypto that really didn't make any sense. Banks weren't even allowed to reasonably custody crypto without having an equal offset to their balance sheet, which really makes no sense for a bank than to even partake in this industry. It's a real industry. That administration wasn't listening to consumers. They weren't listening to the voter and what the voter wanted. We're now seeing a significant change across the board. And an acquisition like that would have made no sense a year ago, and it makes a lot of sense now.
It is truly amazing. I am looking at you and I am remembering, was it 2 or 3 years ago? How long has this lawsuit been slapped on you guys?
December 22nd, 2020.
Okay,
so 4.5
years. We've been talking, and I thought to myself, what's going to happen here? And you are on sort of the edge, the cusp of this just finally disappearing.
For sure. And it's good for Ripple. It's good for XRP, but it's also good for the whole industry. We want these industries not to be pushed offshore. And what was happening in the last 4 years is almost the opposite. We think it's safer to push them to offshore entities.
How many employees do you have? Let's let people understand how many people you employ.
With our acquisition, we employ about 1,100 people now.
That's incredible.
And these are high-paying jobs. And for a period of time, as you and I have talked about before, for really the 4 years of the Biden administration, we did more hiring outside the United States than here at home. As a U.S. citizen, I grew up in Kansas. I'd like to hire people here. We have some of the best talent in the world here. But it made no sense to invest in a market where we couldn't sign customers. We couldn't actually see banks benefit from a better, simpler cross-border settlement for payments. These are technologies that really can help and revolutionize businesses, consumer experiences, but we have to be able to deliver them to these audiences.
Yeah, it was more than 10 years ago, I think, we had the Winklevoss brothers getting rejected for their push to have an ETF that allowed people to invest in Bitcoin. And it was a flat out mic drop no. And now we have so many of those. And this week, an XRP ETF launched, correct?
It hasn't yet traded live in the United States, but we've had, I think, 11 different applications to go live with an ETF trading here in the United States. We do have it trading outside the United States. This is long overdue, and it's a step towards a more institutionalized, safer way for people to participate in these markets. Our acquisition this week, Hidden Road, we paid $1.25 billion for what's called a prime broker. And this allows even larger institutions like BlackRock, like the biggest Wall Street financial institutions, to come into this market in a way they understand with a safer...
Hold on one second. I don't mean to interrupt it, but listen, this is XRP ETF was approved this week. It was the biggest ETF that these companies had.
Down the road, I think it's going to happen sooner rather than later, but let's say spot XRP ETFs are approved. Could this actually hold the spot crypto asset itself in XRP?
Wrong freaking clip, dude. This one it.
It's the first XRP ETF in the US. I'm just curious, how did day one go? I know there's still a little bit of time until market close here as we record this, but what have you seen thus far?
A terrific response. There was overwhelming excitement. I think a lot because we were overlooked. We made our filing and it was largely ignored. We were the only people to file with a ticker, and for whatever reason, it just was passed over, and it kind of took people by surprise. We filed as soon as we could after the old SEC regime left, and the 75 days effectiveness took place on Saturday. So we seeded yesterday, which was Monday, and launched today. I think it's almost a couple 100,000 shares. It's been a terrific, very successful launch. Our most successful launch day to date for any fund we've ever done.
Most successful launch day to day that they've ever done. XRP ETF live in the US. It's actually here. So that's why I was a little confused. That's why I was confused look on my face. That's why maybe Brad's not the guy's running a 1,100 people, all these different, things that are happening. I can't imagine that, hey, he missed that, but all good,
A prime broker to help clear transactions and a bigger balance sheet to do that. It's good for the whole industry.
So your last thought when it comes to the trade war, because people had been saying for a while that Bitcoin and crypto were a hedge against all kinds of concern about a falling dollar. I mean, even Larry Fink said on this network, on this show about a year ago, that it was a hedge against cratering currencies of whoever's country. That hasn't quite come into play. The dollar has been falling really precipitously over the past 5-6 days. In fact, it was continuing, at least as of this morning. It hit a 3-year low against the euro and a 10-year low against the Swiss franc. And crypto, at least today, is moving higher, but it moves all over the place. Yeah. What drives the price of crypto?
I wish I had a clean answer to that question. Like any market, a lot of factors drive that. I mean, there was a period of time as some of the tariff dynamics were playing out where crypto was clearly outperforming the equity markets. But, some people expected it to perform more like gold, where you're seeing all-time highs. I think people are still figuring out how that'll play out. I think the long-term value here is going to be very clear. It is a hedge against inflation. It is a dynamic where the more utility we drive in the crypto markets, the more we're going to see value accrete to that market.
I don't know if you do this, but I'm going to ask you anyway and push you. What is your price target for Bitcoin? Because Cardano blockchain founder.
Why would you ask him about Bitcoin? Come on. Ask him about XRP. Why?
Predicted, as I said earlier, 250,000 by year end.
I will predict Bitcoin. I wouldn't predict XRP. It's too close to home. But I think 200,000 is not unreasonable. I think before I've kind of said, 175 around there. I think people underestimate how the largest economy in the world, the United States, went from headwinds, hostility, to tailwinds. And I think people are still not fully quantifying how significant that is to have the largest economy in the world, the largest asset managers in the world go from relatively frozen out or hostile to now a friendly market that has sensible regulation that is thinking about pro-innovation here at home.
Brad, it's been a long road for you guys over at XRP Ripple, and we'll watch it all. And you've been here from the start trying to tell the story, and now you've got people listening in Washington.
Thank you, Liz. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Hey, not a bad interview. Obviously, there's a few things that I would have loved to ask, but all good. I want to touch on 4 things, okay? Or cross-border transactions. I want to touch on stablecoins. I want to touch on custody, and I want to touch on tokenization, okay? So first, Ripple got into fixing the payment system because that was the biggest problem that was, broken on our planet, right? You're talking about quadrillions of dollars going through a system that was built 50 years ago. It's old, it's antiquated, and it's expensive. So Ripple decided to attack that first. They created all kinds of different products. Some use just messaging, some use XRP to move that value instantaneously, 3 to 5 seconds, right? 90 to 95% savings from what a bank would normally pay going through the SWIFT system. So Ripple did revolutionize that system. That system is now being looked at by, of course, a lot of banks and partners and institutions that are very interested in saving that money and getting that value sent over quickly. When we're talking about, let's bring in stablecoins, okay? So you know what? CBDCs. I forgot CBDCs. CBDCs. If you look at Ripple's website, they've removed every trace of CBDCs from existence. Now, I think they did that because they know the Republican Party has been very anti-CBDC and they didn't want their company to have any kind of, things on it because we are a very emotional economy. And if we do not like something and a company that is supposed to be giving us advice is doing the thing that we don't like, we might not like that company. And Ripple is trying to put their best foot forward. So they did build CBDC technology that banks are very interested in using globally. They do. Ripple, the VP of CBDCs, James Wallace, had mentioned that Ripple is talking with dozens of central banks globally. And I still think that's going to play out as it will over the next 5 to 10 years. When we come into and we talk about stablecoins, this is actually a really fun part to talk about because just had a live chat. And if you've never been to my live sessions, I do those on Tuesdays and Fridays at 3:30 PST. And, I'm able to answer questions for about an hour and just vibe and talk with the audience. And stablecoins was brought up. And so the reason I think stablecoins are so important. I think a lot of people are underestimating the real value there is because, they just see it a 1-for-1 peg. They're not seeing the value that goes into that stablecoin. If that value lives on the XRP ledger, well, there's more value in the XRP ledger itself, and XRP will be more expensive. So as banks come in, the one, if you could think of one word, actually, is it 2 words? If you could think of, a few words that a bank is the first thing that comes to a banker's mind, what would it be? Right. And I probably wouldn't have guessed this, a few years ago, but now I know. De-risk. They want to de-risk everything. Risk is extremely important to them. Not taking on too much risk is extremely important to them. If a bank is interested in a stablecoin, they have a few options. One option is to create their stablecoin themselves. Right? Go through the motions of hiring a team to come and build it, right? Once it's built, you have to audit it. You have to test it. This could take a year, 2 years, 3 years. Who knows? You're going to be priced out, right? Banks do not want to have a stablecoin that, that could, if something bad were to happen where that stablecoin became depegged, and if it was that bank's stablecoin that they created, that could hurt their entire brand. And banks are not going to want to do that. Some banks are never going to take those risks. And also, how much money is it going to cost to bring in a full team of developers, keep them on, right? Because you can't really get rid of them. They have to upgrade the systems, make sure nothing is going wrong, keep track of everything. That is a very tedious and expensive process. Why are banks going to go through all that stuff? Or you could call up Ripple and say, hey, if we notice that you have RLUSD, that's a great technology. It's a stable coin that is going to be, it's being widely adopted by different financial institutions. It's going to be used in Hidden Road. That is $10 billion a day. It makes sense that banks are going to come to Ripple and say, hey, I want to launch a stablecoin on the XRP ledger. Can we lease or use or whatever the technology is? I guarantee you that Ripple is already working on this, right? I've seen a partnership with, I think, a BB. Hold on a second. All right. This is my chat. If you're wondering what you're seeing in front of the screen here, this is my chat. Here it is. Ripple is hiring a product marketing lead. Stablecoin product marketing lead. So who are they marketing stablecoins to? Interesting, right? And if you take a look at this next slide, Ripple and Brazilian bank joined forces to launch an XRP ledger stablecoin. So, Scott Bessent, who's the treasurer of the United States, just said how important stablecoins are going to be to America's future, to making America, the US dollar, the reserve currency of the world still, right? For the next decade, 2 decades, whatever it is. We need stablecoins to do that. So I think people are underestimating how impactful stablecoins will be. And I think Ripple will get business from banks and institutions because they have such great technology with all this compliance built in. And that's exactly what banks need. Tokenization. People are just asleep at the wheel. People need to understand the moment you're in right now is not a, full adoption, let's freaking go moment. Right now, it's a speculation, start stacking assets and pray, right? That's really where we are. If you believe in 4-year cycles, which that has been the trend, we know that this year should be a pretty good year for Bitcoin and the rest of the crypto coins. It's difficult to say what's going to happen with the tariff stuff. That's why Brad said, hey, it's hard to know where this is going, but he thinks Bitcoin's going to go to 175,000. Charles Hoskinson thinks it's going to go to 250,000. There's a lot of time here that people are going to be able to accumulate these assets for the long term if that's what they should choose to do. But the tokenization of assets is going to play out over the next 5 to 10 years. And it'll be interesting to see how quickly this value will come on chain. Will it be a slow drip or will it be all at once? A big bang type of situation. Or a lot of people believe that, a great reset, a financial system collapse, market collapse. I mean, if we keep going the way that we're going today, we could be there before you know it. So cooler heads need to prevail. And I think you do have a lot of forward movement on crypto, but I would not be sleeping on Ripple. They have a plan. They are day and night. Somebody at Ripple is figuring out what is the next steps, what are the next acquisitions, how do we really take this to the next level? And what happens when Ripple does another hidden road, right? 2, 3, 4 hidden roads. Suddenly you have $100 billion being, traded a day on the XRP ledger, and who knows what that'll do to the price, right? Multiplier effect. Anyways, I hope you got something out of this, guys. Thank you so much for being here. I am going to call it. Appreciate you. Hope you enjoyed this.